Hello and welcome back to Felony Spectator. I am your host, Heather. Today we're going to talk about a 40-year-old cold case that has always bothered me because it happened so long ago and there was such little information to report. We are going to talk about Septic Tank Sam. And this case has remained unsolved for so long. Recently, a huge breakthrough in the case occurred. And when I saw it on the news, it just ignited my curiosity. And surprisingly, when I was doing my research, I learned that a lot of people hide bodies in septic tanks, and it's sort of common. And a lot of people think that it's a good idea to hide a body down one of those. Anyways, let's get into it. About 60 kilometers southeast of Edmonton, Alberta, there's a small town called Tofield where an abandoned farmhouse sat. In 1977, Charlie and Mavis McLeod decided to go back to their old farmhouse on their land to see if they could find their old septic tank pump that was left behind years ago. They're building a new house on the property nearby, and this pump would really come in handy. Charlie would first notice that a lot of debris and wood and an old sink and other junk was just piled onto the tank lid, and he didn't remember doing that, but he brushed it off because he was there for just the pump. And these pumps are located inside the septic tank, so he had to clear off the tank and he opened it up. Now, they knew there would be some yucky stuff in a septic tank. It is a septic tank after all, but what they found would be even more shocking. Once Charlie and Mavis opened the tank, they immediately noticed that there was a gray sock sticking out of the murky water. A closer look would reveal that there was also a brown shoe. Now, the property had been abandoned for about 2 years, so there was no explanation as to why this sock or the shoe would be in the tank. And this didn't sit right with Charlie, so he immediately jumped into his car and went to the police station. The police would return, and they'd also have to empty the tank of its contents. So there was still a lot of water and other gross things that you'd find inside a septic tank. So they rigged up a bucket, a rope, and a piece of wood and started bailing the liquids out of the tank. It would take them nearly 6 hours to get all the liquids out. The body itself was in pretty bad shape and decomposed beyond recognition. So it was unclear who this person was, how they died, or even their gender. Investigators also noticed that the killers, or whoever put the body in the tank, had dumped hundreds of pounds of quicklime into the tank in an attempt to dissolve the body faster and hide any pungent odors. Now, contrary to what we think would happen, the lime didn't actually dissolve the body that quickly. Instead, it actually slowed down the decomposition. With that said, he'd still been down there for a really long time and was very unrecognizable. Unfortunately, no other evidence was disposed of inside the tank, like weapons or any clues. And it's not said, but I also assume that they didn't find any footprints or tire tracks. So how he got inside the tank was a complete mystery. The victim would later be described as approximately 28 years old and around 5'6" to 5'9" tall, between 150 and 180 pounds, with medium-length dark hair, wearing a white t-shirt underneath a blue Levi's work shirt with snap buttons. He had on blue jeans, gray wool socks, and a pair of Clark Wallaby-style shoes. It was initially thought that this body was also Caucasian. Fingerprints couldn't be lifted just because of how badly it was decomposed. It would take several months to further investigate the body because of all the injuries. But forensics would eventually find that the body was not only thrown into the septic tank, but he was also brutally beaten. He had been tied up, there was burns on his body and clothes from presumably cigarettes or a small blowtorch or butane lighter. He was also severely sexually mutilated, and the crotch of his pants had been cut and torn open. He was so disfigured in that area by a knife or something sharp that there wasn't much left of his man parts. He was shot at least 2 times in the head and chest with a .32 caliber semi-automatic weapon before being thrown into the septic tank head first. Investigators thought whoever was responsible for this person's death could be local. Most people in town knew the farmhouse was abandoned, but unless you live there, you probably wouldn't even be able to find the home very well, let alone know it was abandoned. Either that the people responsible stalked out the home or were tipped off by someone local. Throwing the victim into this abandoned septic tank would either ensure that they'd never be found or found in a really long time. They obviously had no idea that Charlie and Mavis were going to return and open the tank. Had they bought a new septic tank, this body probably never would have been found. The coroner said that the body could have been stuck down in the tank anywhere between 4 months to a year, but it was really hard to tell due to the quicklime, which slowed down the decomposing process. RCMP needed answers, so they enlisted up to 20 officers to canvass the area and hand out brochures. They thought maybe he was a farm boy or a laborer because of the clothes he was wearing, and there had been lots of laborers working on constructing power lines in the area. But their hopes didn't come up with any leads, as none of the construction companies reported anyone missing. The town was pretty shaken up and actually caused other farmers to check their septic tanks to make sure there was nothing suspicious inside. Housewives were scared to be alone in their homes, and the owner of the town's co-op was concerned that it could have been one of his customers. This was obviously before DNA was a thing, so all the police had to go on were missing person reports, and strangely, no one had come forward with a missing persons report in the past year or so that matched the description of the victim. The only other explanation would be that maybe he was a transient or someone from another province. Because of this, there were no suspects, no motive, no evidence other than finding a body. So who was this guy and how did he get in there? Eventually, the body would be nicknamed Septic Tank Sam. Sam's dental records would be sent to about 800 different dentists in Alberta because Sam still had all of his teeth and had some recent dental work done as well. But his dental work did appear to be kind of subpar or done cheaply, so they thought maybe he could have been someone on government assistance. The dental records were also featured in a number of dental magazines in hopes that someone could identify the work that was done. Unfortunately, nothing came up. His teeth did not match any records on file, so he would eventually be laid to rest in a cemetery in Edmonton. In 1979, the case was reopened, and a forensic pathologist named Dr. Clyde Snow from Oklahoma was asked to do a reconstruction of Sam's skull to help identify him. So they exhumed Sam's body, and the doctor was able to take all sorts of measurements, and it was then determined that Sam was most likely Aboriginal, closer to 35. He was also able to come up with a sort of 3D composite, which was released to the public. By 1983, more facial recognition pictures were released in the newspapers in Alberta, but still no one came forward, so police finally released some more details to the public that weren't in the media before. They revealed that he was rolled up in a yellow bedsheet, and it was tied with a nylon rope specifically around his head. And I guess nobody was missing a yellow bedsheet because that didn't help solve the case either. They also said that the victim wasn't white. They let the public know that he was more likely Aboriginal. Over the next 36 years, several new facial recognition photos have been released, and hopeful families thought perhaps it was their missing loved one, but none of these leads ever determined who the real identity of Sam was. There were many theories, some by the police and lots by the public. Some people thought that maybe Sam committed a sex crime or cheated on his spouse based on the mutilation of his body, and other people thought maybe something went wrong with a swingers club. Lots of people suspected drug dealers from Edmonton, but whoever it was had a big problem with Sam and wanted him to suffer. After all these years, everything is only an assumption until now. Septic Tank Sam now has a name, Gordon Edwin Sanderson, and he was in fact from Edmonton. A lab in Texas helped with the identification using genetic genealogy. So basically, they found a family member by using his DNA and compared it to a public genealogy website. It's not said what website was used, but it could be something like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA. A family member used one of those sites and it flagged Gordon's DNA. So RCMP were able to reach out to the family member and then further match the DNA to his sister, Joyce Sanderson. Gordy, which is what his family called him, was 25 years old when he was killed. His family had tried to find him, but unfortunately, there was nothing that tied his missing person report to the Septic Tank Sam case. He was originally born in Manitoba on October 22nd, 1950. Sadly, he was separated from his family at the age of 9, back when the Canadian government used to take Aboriginal kids from their homes and they'd stick them into foster care or residential schools. If you Google 60s Scoop, it will give you more information, but in a nutshell, Aboriginal children were basically scooped from their home and put into foster care, then adopted out to white families. And sadly, this continued well into the 70s and into the mid-80s. I grew up in a community that has a lot of Aboriginals, and I couldn't imagine what it would feel like to see one of my friends at school just disappear because the government thought they'd be better off in a white home. It's really sickening what Canada did. There was also an Adopt a Métis program in Alberta, which was very similar. Middle-class white families could adopt Aboriginal children and essentially whitewash them. The excuse was that these kids were born illegitimately or were in a home where a marriage breakdown occurred. Anyways, there's so much more involved into what Canada did to the Aboriginal communities that it would need its own episode. So a lot of the Aboriginal kids who went through these programs ended up eventually being homeless, or they would turn to drugs or alcohol because of the trauma they endured. Gordy was sadly one who ended up with an addiction problem and would end up living in downtown Edmonton. At the time of his disappearance, he was on his way to visit his brother Arthur in Calgary, but he sadly never made it. Now, I don't know if that was normal or not, but his brother didn't report him. Their sister had lost touch with them as well for a few years, but in 1980, when she couldn't locate Gordy, she finally would file a missing persons report then. It was more likely that the time discrepancy didn't really link the two cases together. Police suspect that Gordy was killed by people who were either involved in drugs or criminal activity in Edmonton, and they're looking to speak with anyone who knew Gordy in the 70s. Gordy's family is both happy that he's been identified and they have the start to some answers, but they're also grieving and mad that their brother was tortured and treated so badly. The police have said that they'll continue investigating, but they fear that whoever did this to Gordy's probably dead themselves by now, or maybe even in jail, and they're not really hopeful to find any answers. However, they do encourage anyone with any tips to contact the RCMP. That's it for today. It's short and sweet. I am gearing up for a 2-part episode soon, so stay tuned. Thanks again for joining me here at Felony Spectator. We'll see you next week.